Accreditation. I'm George ILIEV, Director of Accreditation in emerging markets, and that's mostly emerging markets, East Asia, Russia, Latin America. Development markets in this sense means pretty much markets that we couldn't quite describe as purely emerging markets, because I'm in charge of China, but also of Japan, and I'm in charge of Latin America, but also of Spain. So that's why I'm talking to you about accreditation. My background is quite closely related to China and Japan. My first job was in China, but my second job was working with Japanese business news, editing Japanese business news for Reuters Business Briefing and for Dow Jones. And I used to teach China business and economy at Sofia University in Bulgaria, where I'm from. Now, I have a confession to make. I have an MBA. I did my MBA in the US and Hong Kong. And I also have an MBA in another sense. It's the year of the golden monkey, and this is what we call monkey business approximation, MBA. The more you can resemble a monkey, the better an MBA you are. Just for this year. And in my spare time, when I'm not dealing with MBA stuff, I write a blog exploring the parallels between nature and business. It's called Corporate Nature, and I've done that's from a TED talk I did in May. Now, you have noticed probably much earlier than me that we live in a fractal world where the boundaries between things are not clear-cut anymore. So study is no longer just part-time or full-time. Work is not separate from studying. They're all mixed together. And the interesting challenges are on the edges. And that's why AMBA reviews the accreditation criteria every 5 years to make sure that we are up to date. How do we do that? I'll tell you two stories. The first story is from Japan from 400 years ago, when accreditation was booming. The East India Company, the British East India Company, wanted to start selling products to Japan. And England back then didn't have much to sell apart from wool, sheep's wool and woolen cloth. And the East Indian merchants, East India Company merchants, approached the Japanese and offered them to sell them woolen cloth. But the Japanese said, no thank you. And why they decided so? Because they looked at the merchants themselves, and the rich merchants were wearing silk, and the poor people in England were wearing cotton. And who was wearing wool? Why buy something that does not, that you yourself are not committed to? How is this related to accreditation? We practice what we preach. I have an MBA, and I used to teach at university. Professor Andrew Locke is here. He's not only a top academic and dean, but he also has an MBA from London Business School. Our chief executive, Andrew Wilson, has an AMP from Harvard. And Martin Jones, Professor Martin Jones, he does not have an MBA, but he has an MPA, in addition to all his deanship experience, a Master's in Public Administration, which we also accredit as part of the MBA portfolio. So we do practice what we preach. The second story is even older, from the Library of Alexandria, more than 2,000 years ago. When accreditation was booming as well. The city of Alexandria had a very interesting policy. They would stop all traders entering the city search their luggage, and if they found a book, they would take it to the library, and if the library did not have this book, they would copy it. And the most interesting thing was they would return to the owner a copy of the book and keep the original. What we did in the review of the accreditation criteria is we asked all of you for your suggestions, what needs to be changed over a one-year period in 2015. And we collected your feedback, and we gave you back the updated MBA criteria. Now, I will focus on 4 key changes in the new MBA criteria. The online MBA, the Carousel model of delivery, the caps on credit transfer, and MBA attributes. Starting with the online MBA, AMBA has been accrediting blended learning programs, distance learning programs, for more than a decade. But we've always required some on-campus classes. So it was always a mix between online and a physical presence on campus. And then, in the last 2 years, we started noticing that the technology is changing. I'm showing you this Shinkansen, if you've already guessed this, from Japan. Because in Japan, there is something called the 800-kilometer rule, and it applies to pretty much all high-speed train travel. If the distance is less than 800 kilometers, it makes sense to travel by high-speed train. If it is longer than 800 kilometers, you're better off flying. That used to be the case for a decade or 2. But recently, with the improvements of high-speed train travel, these 800 kilometers have become less relevant. Because sometimes people who could take in China a high-speed train that is 1,000 kilometers, and say Beijing, Shanghai, and they're still better off than flying. That's why we noticed that as technology is getting better, schools were asking for the opportunity to launch fully online MBA programs. And we set up a working group with Professor Andrew Locke and members of the International Accreditation Advisory Board. And we came up with a very simple set of criteria for the online MBA. It is basically that the learning outcomes should be comparable to an on-campus or a blended learning program. As simple as that. Now, there are quite a few misconceptions about online learning. I wrote this article for CEO magazine last year, and just 2 of the misconceptions are that the people who go for an online degree are that it's a substitute for on-campus. And actually it is not. It is more of a booster. And the second misconception is that the online education is for the millennials. And it turns out that millennials actually want an on-campus experience. It's for later in your career, when you're under work pressure and family pressure, that you start to appreciate the benefits of online education much more. So we came up with the criteria for this simple 1 criterion, basically. The outcomes should be comparable. Which means that currently we only accredit programs, and we can only create a fully online MBA at schools that already have accredited traditional delivery on campus or blended. So only the 245 schools that are already accredited are allowed to launch a fully online MBA that will be AMBA accredited. And we have had our first fully online MBA accredited in the spring at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And just as a reminder, we put in the criteria, the inputs that you shouldn't forget, but they're pretty much the same as as any of your other MBA programs. It's more of a reminder, really, than anything new. Now, moving on to the Carousel model. For the first time in our criteria, we explicitly mention the Carousel model of delivery. What does that mean? In some Western European schools, with the financial crisis, cohort size, intake numbers came under pressure. And often schools were struggling to recruit classes of 20 students, which is what our minimum is for a separate MBA program. And then schools became more creative and started overlapping. Some schools created this overlapping model where, for instance, you have an intake of 15 students in March, and then you have an intake of 15 students in September, and they join this program as it goes, and they get on and get off at different times. And initially we were a bit skeptical because there are no prerequisites. You might be doing marketing before you've done macroeconomics. So that was a minus. But the plus side was the added diversity, the addition, the guarantee of quality, because the school would be much more committed to teaching a class of 30 or 45 and getting them good faculty and making sure that the experience was good, as opposed to teaching 15 students. So it was a trade-off, and we agreed that this trade-off is actually to the benefit of the students. However, there is still one condition. The burden is on the school to make sure that if someone is struggling with basic concepts in, say, marketing, if they don't know about price elasticity from their macroeconomics, the school has to find mechanisms to basically make up classes to help them, bring them on board. But just as in life, an MBA program mimics the inequalities of real life, and some students will be better prepared than others. And in the Japanese context, it's like the Japanese snow monkeys, which go in and go out of the pool at different times, but they all enjoy it, as you can tell from their red faces.